As we noted, we've got a guest speaker this morning who will be coming to us via Zoom, and we are very excited to hear Adam DePaul speak this morning. Patty Fleetwood will give a brief introduction. Before we get there, I've got a couple of readings that I'll offer, and I will note that after Adam speaks, he's going to leave some room open for question and answer if we've got questions. So Zoom folks, you can be ready at that point to raise your hands and put things in the chat so that he sees them, and folks here will bring a microphone around to you if you have questions that you'd like to ask him after he speaks. But first, our two readings, because we wouldn't be church without two readings, right? And because I'm not preaching, I didn't think to print anything out, so I'm going to act like someone younger than I am and read them from my phone. The first is a poem by the poet Kim Stafford, which seemed just like a great thing, appropriate, contextually appropriate today as well. Advice from a Raindrop. Kim Stafford, Advice from a Raindrop. You think you're too small to make a difference? Tell me about it. You think you're helpless, at the mercy of forces beyond your control? Been there. Think you're doomed to disappear, just one small voice among millions? That's no weakness, trust me. That's your wild card, your trick, your implement. They won't see you coming until you're there in their faces, shining, festive, expendable, eternal. Sure, you're small, just one small part of a storm that changes everything. That's how you win, my friend, again and again and again. And our Bible reading this morning, one of the assigned readings comes from the book of Proverbs. It's Proverbs 8 selected verses of that. This is a poem that personifies wisdom. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out, "To you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all that live." The Lord created me at the beginning of her work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth. When she had not yet made earth and fields or the world's first bits of soil, when they established the heavens, I was there. When she drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made from the sky firm the skies above, when she established the fountains of the deep, when they assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when she marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside them like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before her always, rejoicing in their inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. This is God's good news. I turn it over to Patty Fleetwood, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Skip. Good morning, everybody. Adam Waterbear DePaul is the story keeper and Rising Nation River Journey Coordinator for the Lenape Nation, where he is also a Tribal Nation Council member. He co-curated the Lenape Cultural Center in Easton, PA, and the exhibit Existing Artistry, Enduring Presence, the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania at Temple University. Adam is also an instructor at Temple and the co-founder of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Temple. Adam has also been one of my teachers for the last 8 months. His mom, Shelley, the nation's chief of education and language, has written a textbook to preserve the Lenape language, and Adam teaches classes with her. Adam always has a great little trick to help us understand the language and culture. He's the only one, for example, who could get us to understand how to use the 2 different we's they have in the Lenape language. As story keeper, Adam preserves the history and stories of his culture, one that seems to share many of our values. The Lenape people care for and respect the land, and to show this, Adam began the river journey in 2002. Every 4 years, the Lenape Nation travels down the Delaware River, or the Lenape Sipu, And Friends of the Lenape, who are committed to preserving the river, sign a treaty of renewed friendship with the tribe. The next river journey is this summer. Our Environmental Justice Committee certainly made a good choice in inviting Adam DePaul to speak to us today. Adam, Tamike, Patamwe Gown. Nope, wait, Patamwe Gowning. I'm trying to say welcome to our church in Lenape, and I don't know how to say our, but Tamike is welcome. And Patamwe Gown is church, and Ing is too. So I think I'm close. Welcome.
Oh, those possessive words are so hard. We will be getting to those soon. And Monishi, thank you, Patty, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody, for having me here today. As Patty said, there are so many shared goals and initiatives and a shared spirit in our communities. And so much of that has already become evident today, just listening to your wonderful open words and your opening program. It's wonderful. It was wonderful for me to hear in the opening words today that you were remembering all of our relations, not just the two-leggeds, but the four-leggeds and the winged ones, and the creepy crawlers and the fish people, and the long human being, the river, and the grandfather rocks. It's also wonderful to hear you acknowledging and looking for understanding towards our two-spirit people. So I want to give you a very, very brief history of our people, just to familiarize you with who I am and who the Lenape people are, and who my nation is, Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, who I'm here representing today. And then I want to talk about what we're doing today and the spirit in which I come here today. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions, anything I can expand upon after that. But our story, our history, and our presence, we have found is very well framed by a story that has come to us through our chief, Bob Redhawk. This is not a traditional ancient story. This is a family story that has come down through the oral tradition, through our chief's grandparents and their grandparents, and has come to him. And I'd like to share it with you. It's very short. It's often called the story of the four crows. And it goes like this. It is said that a fox will be loosed upon the earth. It is also said 4 crows will come. The first crow, he flew in harmony with Creator. The second crow, he tried to clean the world, but he got sick and died. The third crow, he saw what happened to his brother, and he hid. The fourth crow will fly in harmony with Creator again. Caretakers, we live upon the earth. And that's all. Just a few short lines that Chief Bob's family would tell him that came down to him. But we've seen this as a wonderful, or at least an apt framework to discuss our history and where we are today. The first crow who flies in harmony with Creator, we see this being a good symbol for our time pre-colonialism, living here before we had contact. The second crow, who tried to clean the world but became sick and died, we see this symbolizing the time of contact when colonists came over. And that first part where the crow tries to clean the world, we recognize here our relationship with William Penn. William Penn, we had a wonderful relationship with William Penn that we still honor to this day. William Penn went out of his way to treat with us, to deal with us fairly and justly, and to try to correct some of the less altruistic relationships that other settlers had established with us. And I want to read very briefly from William Penn's first letter to us. He writes uh, to the Lenape people, he writes, "My friends, there is one great God and power that hath made ye world and all things therein, so whom you and I and all people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one day give an account for all that we do in this world. This great God hath written his law in our hearts, by which we are taught and commanded to love and help and do good to one another, and not to do harm and mischief unto one another. Now this great God hath been pleased to make me concerned in parts of the world, and the king of the country where I live hath given unto me a great province therein, but I desire to enjoy it with your love and consent, that we may all always live together as neighbors and friends. Else, what would the great God say to us, who hath made us not to devour and destroy one another, but live soberly and kindly together in the world?" Those wonderful words are just the opening of Penn's letter, and you can find that online if you'd like to read the whole thing. But that spirit of living together in friendship and in harmony um, is the relationship we still celebrate today with William Penn, and also the spirit in which I come here to visit all of you today. Now, with William Penn's sons, our relationship turned. Penn's sons did not carry on his father's spirit, and much of the history with which you are all to some extent familiar, the forced removals, the wars, the violence that would come later on, began around the time of Penn's sons. At this time, many of our people were forced to be removed from our homeland. Now, we are the indigenous people of this area: Eastern Pennsylvania, Southern New York, all of New Jersey, and Northern Delaware. This is what we call the Lenape, the place where we come from. Our people who were removed, they went in all directions, going however far they could to feel that they were safe. And today we have communities of that diaspora that have survived in Oklahoma, in Wisconsin, and in Canada. In those three places, there are recognized Lenape nations, nations that the government has recognized. And of course, we also have people all over in other areas who do not have large enough communities to be their own nation, but are still part of our diaspora and carry on our ways. Now, my story and the story of my nation and our Eastern Woodland nations out here in New Jersey and Delaware, our story is symbolized by the third crow, the crow that saw what had happened to his brother and hid. While many of our people were removed, many others of us stayed here. And there are a number of ways that could happen. One of the primary ways was between marriages, between Lenape women and colonial men. We had some very good relationships with many of the settlers that came over here, dating back even before Penn's time. And through these marriages, some of our people were able to remain here and carry on our ways, our traditions, our culture, our language. Now, in the colonized Lenape hooking, these things could not be celebrated publicly. In the public, you did not speak the Lenape language, you did not dress in your traditional dress, you certainly did not practice any ceremonies. But we pass these ways down through the oral tradition, through our children, through our daughters and granddaughters, our sons and grandsons. And for centuries, we continued these ways in hiding. Now, this is the way we continued our culture until very recently, historically very recently. And within the last few decades, we find ourselves, we like to think that we are coming into the time of the fourth crow, that crow who will fly in harmony with Creator again. And we see this as speaking to us because recently, again, over the past few decades, and it seems like more and more every year, people want to hear our story. We have been welcomed by the community to come out and once again publicly proclaim our presence and our community, and to be partners in goodwill with our neighbors and reestablish that spirit that William Penn um, offered in his words so long ago. And this is incredibly important to our people, not only obviously because we want to live in harmony again with all of our neighbors, but also because our story has been so erased here, because we had to live in hiding. Very few people know who the Lenape are. And if they are familiar with the Lenape, they think that we come from Oklahoma or Wisconsin or Canada. They don't realize that we come from here in the Lenape-Hoking in the Northeast, and that our diaspora were forced out that way. So it's important to us spiritually and culturally to be welcomed back into the community. And being welcomed here today by all you wonderful folks, that is such a huge part of that. That is part of the fourth crow. And that is part of the era that is bringing our people back together, being able to have public pride in our community, being able to celebrate our culture and reestablish our traditions, our language, our ceremonies with pride. So when I say thank you for having me here today, that's not just a polite introduction. It is so important to our nation, to our people, and to our youth who are growing up in the culture, who are growing up in the fourth crow, um, to be invited by our neighbors to come tell our story and help uh, correct the misinformation that has been told about us, and to reestablish good relations with our neighbors. So thank you, Monishi, for having me. And today in the fourth crow, as Patty mentioned, we have a number of wonderful initiatives to carry on our traditions and to reestablish and revitalize much of our culture that was lost. One of the things of which we are most proud is our language program. Language is inextricably tied up with culture. So much of a person's culture exists in their language. And over centuries of not being able to practice our language publicly, much of it was buried very deeply. And we are very fortunate today that we have a strong language program to help revitalize and bring our language and our culture back in that way. And Patty is one of our language keepers, and we're very thankful for that. Another very strong initiative we have that also fits into some of your opening words and program is to be good stewards of the environment. It is tied up with everything it means to be Lenape, from our earliest creation stories to the prayers we offer in our ceremonies every month when we meet. It is essential to what it means to be Lenape, to be a good steward of the environment, to live in harmony with all of our relations. And again, that means the animals, the trees, the rocks, the rivers, all our relations. And we're very happy to have partners with wonderful people in the community. So many more than I could mention here. People like the Audubon Society, the Friends of the Wissahickon watershed organizations. We do all we can to promote good stewardship of the environment today. And one of our biggest initiatives in this way is the Rising Nation River Journey, which we do every 4 years. We paddle down the river, the Delaware River, for about 3 weeks. We begin up in Hancock, New York, and we paddle all the way down to Cape May, New Jersey. Now there's a stretch in the Philadelphia area we have to skip because that's commercial boats only. But we drive into Philadelphia to include the Philadelphia area on our trip. And all down the river, we sign the Treaty of Renewed Friendship, which asks its treaty signers two things. One, that they acknowledge the Lenape as the indigenous people of the Lenape Hoking, and they spread that knowledge however they're able. And two, that they act as good stewards of their environment in whatever way they're able, whether that just means being personally responsible and picking up their trash when they're outside, or whether that means getting involved in large projects to protect our environment. So that's coming around in this summer, begins July 30th and goes through August 20th. All of you are invited to come out and see us. It'd be very nice to see some of you at one of our treaty signings, or if you're a river person, to come paddle with us on the river. You're welcome to do that too. You're welcome to come sign the treaty, or just come and observe. Our itinerary is on our website. It lets you know where we will be and when. So that's about all I want to talk at you about. I just want to again say it's so wonderful to be here and to hear everything you're doing for all of our relations and for our relations that come from all aspects of life. And please, I have time and I would very much like to hear your questions. Anything you're curious about, something I mentioned but didn't go into detail about, or something I didn't mention at all. Let me know what interests you.
Thank you so much for that. And there is a little space here for folks who are on Zoom. You can put questions in chat if you've got them, or raise your hands. We'll make sure that we can hear you. Folks in the sanctuary, if you've got questions, we can bring the microphone around to you. I wonder if I could start with just what I imagine is a very basic question, but I love the title with which you were introduced of the Story Keeper. I wonder if you can say a little bit about what that title is, or what that means.
Certainly. Many people think because I'm a story keeper, that means that I am a storyteller. And that is not necessarily the case. Now, I do also tend to be a storyteller. I'm a lifelong educator. I've spent a lot of a lot of time in classrooms, and I enjoy speaking. So I do also tell stories. But the role of the story keeper is not to tell the stories, but it is, just as it sounds, to keep the stories. And I keep the knowledge of any stories that are important to the nation. Now, this includes things you might think of immediately, like our oldest cultural stories, our creation and emergence stories, the stories of how our relations got their names, and our most significant culture heroes who taught us the ceremonies and the ways that we practice today. But that also includes any other stories that are important to our nation. Things like our line of chiefs, our struggles through state recognition, major events and powwows, and keeping the story of the river journey. So I keep that knowledge of those stories, and when our more esteemed storytellers, our ceremonial leaders, want to tell stories, they might come to me and say, well, I've been telling the Mising story for 7 years now at Mising ceremony, and I'm thinking I want to change it up. What are some other good stories that fit the occasion? They might come to me and we'd have that discussion, and I can help them in that way.
Thank you. We've got a question here in the sanctuary.
Thank you for your message. I heard you say that there was Lenape members in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Canada. I mean, what are those numbers, and are you thinking about coming back to your old territory?
Well, I also definitely want to mention that we have relations here in the East Coast in the Lenape-Hoking as well. My nation is the nation of Pennsylvania. We are the only Lenape nation in Pennsylvania. But right over the border in New Jersey, we have the Nanticoke Lenape, the Ramapo Lenape, and the Sand Hill Lenape, 3 nations in New Jersey. And we also have nations in Delaware State. So our nations today very much represent their own histories and their own locations. So those of us here on the East Coast, we have that history of the third crow, of remaining here in our homeland in hiding. Our relations in Oklahoma, they have their own rich, very rich and valuable Lenape history that begins telling a different story at the time of the forced relocation. They tell the story of their travels westward and southward, their interlocking with other tribes that welcomed them and helped them on their journey, and their life in Oklahoma and in Wisconsin and in Canada over the last 100, 200 years. So our nations exist today in their areas, and each with their own very valuable history. And our Canadian people are welcomed by the Canadian government. Our Oklahoma people are recognized by the state of Oklahoma. So the mission of our diaspora is not to leave the place where they're from and all come back here, although of course they come back often, and we always open our arms to them to come back and visit the Lenape-Hoking, and of course we welcome them to come back and live in the Lenape-Hoking again. But it's important to also understand that they have their own rich history in their own states for which they've been in for hundreds of years, and they teach that history and carry on that culture in those places, just as we do here.
I see Joy Berge's hand is up on Zoom. Joy, go ahead.
Adam, thank you. This has been fascinating and encouraging. Glad to hear that William Penn actually had it right, and that's not just, whitewashing, if I can use that term. Sorry to hear the Suns went off track, and not surprised. I grew up in this area in Delaware County, and I was made aware of the Native peoples, I don't know, from my childhood, which was good. But in those days, we talked about the Lenape tribe, and that has, now we just hear about the Lenape. I'm just curious, can you give me any insights into who the Lenni people were? My mom grew up in a little town pronounced Lenape in Delaware County.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. There are 3 terms by which you'll often hear us referred: Lenape, Lenni, Lenape, and Delaware. Now, the best word to use when you're referring to us is simply Lenape. Okay? Lenni Lenape is actually a grammatical redundancy that developed through a misunderstanding of our language. Lenape translates roughly into original people. Now, somewhere along the line, someone tried to call us the Lenape people in our language, and they called us the Lenni Lenape, but that basically translates into original people. Now, while there's a grammatical hitch with the term, it's important to realize that many of our people identify with that term Lenni Lenape. They grew up with that term. That's what they have been called for centuries, and that is the term they use today. Our relations in South Jersey are called the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape. There's nothing wrong with that term as a form of cultural identity. But when you're talking about us, it's best just to use the word Lenape. The word Delaware, of course, that was bestowed upon us by a colonial person who came down the river and discovered us. I believe he was an admiral, and his name was War, W-A-R-R, Delaware. So he came in and he discovered our people, and then we became Delaware's people, just like the river became Delaware's river. So yes, Lenape is the best word.
There's a question in the chat from Charles Gilmore. His question is, are the stories written or passed on verbally to future generations? And is there a written Lenape language?
That's a wonderful and a complicated question. In my academic life, my specialty is on mythology and how cultural stories are passed on. And our stories have always been told through the oral tradition. We did not have a written language until the colonists came over and began recording our speech. Now, of course, ever since then, and more recently, some of our stories have been written down. We have a literature anthology that we have collected through interviews with our elders. And while our stories remain fairly obscure, it's difficult to find a lot on the Lenape people. A lot of what is out there, we often get lumped in with the Algonquin Indians, which are a language group up here in the Northeast, and you don't really know what is Lenape and what isn't. But we do have written records that you can find, and certainly we have them within the nation. What I always emphasize, though, is that it is not in the spirit of our stories to refer to a document, to refer to a written page. And when you come across our stories, or when I'm asked to write one of our stories down, it's important to remember that that is just a slice of that story's life, a photograph that was taken of that story in that moment, how it was told in that time. And that our stories continue to grow and evolve and continue with us and remain relevant to our culture by telling them through the oral tradition and having them pass through our people and our elders and our clan mothers. So that's kind of a split answer. As far as our language, we do have my mother, our chief of education and language, has spent her life developing a textbook so that she could teach the Lenape language to our students. So we do have a pretty wonderful textbook that our students learn from.
Oh, okay, we've got another question in the sanctuary. I'll bring the microphone.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating as well. I have a question for you. You mentioned something about two spirits. What is that exactly? What is two spirits?
Two-Spirit is how we and many other Native American tribes have referred to as people that do not fit what we would call today the two significant gender roles, the male and female. Our Two-Spirit members involve both homosexuality and transgenderism and other lifestyles and spiritualities that don't fit the dominant gender roles that we have in society today. And our Two-Spirit have always been cherished. And again, this is not just Lenape, it is the case in many Native American tribes, have been cherished for their wisdom and their open-minded view, where some of us can be very restricted by the roles that society puts on us for gender. Our Two-Spirit are respected for being able to see beyond those strict lines and have open perspectives. And hence the term two-spirit, embodying both the spirits.
Thank you so much for all that you've brought to us this morning.